In this episode, let's have a look at the Smooth 2 Gimbal for smartphones. Camera movement can add a lot to your video production value if you have motivation for movement. But of course, if you try to handhold the camera and walk around, you're going to get a pretty jittery look. And sometimes that's okay if that's the look you're going for, but often you want a smoother look that's not as distracting. Like all other motorized gimbals, this has motors on it as well. It has 3 motors, so it's a 3-axis gimbal. And as you walk and move, it actually smooths those movements out so that the resulting video footage is smooth and pleasant to watch. Setup on the Smooth 2 is very simple. All you have to do is mount your phone in the little harness itself, center the harness on the back of the phone, and then if you are using one of the larger phones, you'll also need to put this counterweight on, which just twists on, and then you're set to go pretty much. Now, if things don't seem to be balancing just right, you can also calibrate by hooking this up to your computer via USB and using a calibration tool, which is very simple. It just tells you to move it into different positions. It kind of measures how things are sitting, and it calibrates the gimbal very nicely. So it takes about a minute to do that, so it's pretty straightforward as well. Now, one additional feature of the Smooth 2, which is very nice with smartphones, is that you can download an app onto your Android or iOS phone, and then the phone and the gimbal can communicate so that the controls on the gimbal can be used to control the camera on the phone, which is very nice. That means you don't have to touch the camera or the phone while you're actually operating the gimbal, which makes things smoother as well. The controls on the handle can do all sorts of things, including start and stop recording, pan or tilt the camera a different direction with the little joystick at your thumb, change the shooting modes, zoom the camera, and change to the front-facing camera for selfie video. Very nice. And again, as I said, apps for both iOS and Android. Now, to charge the battery for the gimbal, you just plug in the USB cable that's included with the kit, and it takes about 2.5 hours to charge the battery fully from completely empty. There is a threaded 1/4-20 hole on the bottom so that you can mount the Smooth 2 on a tripod or on a longer pole or even a selfie stick. It should be a pretty substantial pole if you do that. The Smooth 2 weighs in right around 1 pound or 395 grams. Now, that also comes in handy if you're going to use the face detection feature, which means that it can follow faces. This can be super helpful when you're shooting a demonstration where you may be moving around and you don't have a friend or anyone on hand to operate the camera. It works pretty well. Like most face detection, it isn't perfect if the talent moves too quickly or turns away from the camera, but it does as well as any camera I've used with face tracking. The specifications say that you can expect about 5 hours of battery life, and in my testing, that seems to be holding up true. It is very efficient if you can get your camera or your phone balanced just right. So if things are off by a little bit, you want to make sure that you go ahead and do a calibration the first time, and that should hold for a good long time. You can always calibrate it again later. It doesn't seem to need it a whole lot, though, like some other finicky gimbals. This one seems to get it, and as long as you're using that same phone, it seems to do a nice job keeping that. Another nice little touch is that for the larger phones, like the iPhone 7 Plus, which is what most of the footage here was shot with, which is a larger phone, it has a little high-density foam pad that sits at the top of the handle, and what that does is it prevents the camera, when you turn the gimbal off, from swinging around and smashing its glass on the top of the handle. Just a nice thought. Now, if you've never used a motorized gimbal before, or any sort of gimbal, there is a technique that you have to use. You can't just throw your camera or your phone on there, start running around and expect super smooth footage. There is a technique. You do need to take small steps. You usually kind of bend down into your knees a little bit while you're walking. Also, do your best to isolate your arm from the movement of the rest of your body. And when you do that, the gimbal seems to work pretty nicely. One other thing I noticed is that this seems to work best if you hold the handle approximately 45 degrees to 90 degrees from the ground. And when you do that, it seems to smooth things out. If you go parallel with the ground or turn it sideways with the handle parallel to the ground, I found that it generally shows most of your footsteps. So if you want to avoid showing those footsteps, you'll want to hold the handle at 45 to 90 degrees perpendicular to the ground. I've also found that to get the best footage from your phone when you're using it on the gimbal or anywhere is that any movement that you make with the camera, you want it to be not too fast. Now, you can move. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't move, of course, with a gimbal, but if you move and you try to do whip pans and things of that nature where you pan really quickly or anything's moving super quickly, that will stress the codec of most phones. The cameras are made on phones to be very, very efficient in terms of the amount of information that they store because phones have a fairly limited amount of memory overall. And so the codecs are very, very aggressive at being as efficient as possible. So if you add a lot of movement, that's where the codec starts to stress. You can see in this footage here, for example, that as I start moving very quickly, the extraordinary detail in the grass that I'm walking over doesn't look very realistic. It's definitely some artifacting in there, and it's definitely sort of tearing apart a little bit. So that is something to keep in mind when you are shooting with a phone, and where phones are not quite as good as more capable cameras. Now, that being said, I've been very impressed in terms of what I could get out of this with my iPhone 7 Plus and the gimbal itself. A lot of the footage looks really, really nice, and I've actually used it in a couple of my episodes in the past, fairly recent past, if you hadn't noticed, and really, really happy with the results. Now, one question I'm sure I'm going to get is, how does this compare to the DJI Osmo Mobile? Well, the truth is, I don't know. I've not used the DJI Osmo Mobile, but what I can say is that just in terms of specifications, the main difference that I can see is that the Smooth 2 actually can pan and tilt farther than the DJI Osmo can. That may or may not be important to you, but that's really kind of the only difference I see in terms of specifications. Now, there are 3 different modes on the gimbal to optimize for different shooting conditions. The first one is called the pan following mode. This is the default mode, and what this does is it allows you to smooth pan as you turn the gimbal handle. So it'll actually follow your pan, but it will lock the roll so the camera won't tip to the side, and it will also lock it to keep it from tilting up or down. There's also locking mode. What you do is you press the joystick button and then you're in locking mode, which locks onto whatever you have the camera pointed at when you put it into this mode. And then it just compensates for your movement. So there's no panning, no tilting, and no rolling. This is really good for product shots or for following your talent. Then there's also pan and tilt following mode. What this does is that as you move the gimbal handle, it will tilt up or tilt down gently, kind of follow your movement. And it will do the same for a pan to the right or to the left. So it just sort of gently smooths out your movements as you're panning and tilting. So there is a look at the Zhiyun Smooth 2. I hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that, and be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.